Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak to each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times national correspondent Kate Zernike to today's program. Dispassionately and objectively, she's been explaining the Tea Party movement since its beginning less than 2 years ago and how it has grown. She explains the movement to us in her new book, Boiling Mad, Inside Tea Party America, which has just been published by the Times Books imprint of Henry Holt and Company. Welcome.
Thank you.
You can't pick up the newspaper these days without reading about the mischief or whatever that the Tea Party people are up to, and yet they haven't been around that long, less than 2 years. Tell us about how it got started.
It is a really remarkable transformation because you remember, obviously there was this huge outpouring of support and enthusiasm for Barack Obama when he was inaugurated in January of 2009. But it was just a month later that the Tea Party, that we started seeing the first incarnations of the Tea Party. I trace the first Tea Party, and a lot of Tea Party leaders point to the first Tea Party leader or the first Tea Partier as a young woman in Seattle, which is sort of the last place that I expected to find a Tea Party supporter, a Tea Party leader. Her name is Kelly Carrinder. She's 29 years old. She's half Mexican. She lives with an Obama supporter. She's now married to him, but they were engaged at the time. And she teaches basic math to welfare recipients. She performs with an improv company on weekends. She's got a pierced nose. I looked at her and thought, okay, Seattle, Obama voter. But in fact, she had been reading a lot of free market economists and libertarian economists. And in February of 2009, when the new president proposed his stimulus bill, she felt like this was exactly the wrong response to the recession. And so she's complaining to her fiance, this Obama supporter, and he kind of says, do it elsewhere. Why don't you start a blog? So she starts a blog and feels like that's not enough and she's not getting her frustration out. So she decides she's going to have a protest. And she lives in Seattle where there have been these protests against the war and against the World Trade Organization. And she says, hey, if they can do it, I can do it better. And she becomes kind of the prototype for Tea Party protests across the country. She starts out small, but she phones a local conservative radio host, and he offers a plug for her, and she emails Michelle Malkin, who's a conservative blogger, and Michelle Malkin puts it on her blog. And so she gets about 120 people to her first protest. And this is sort of how the Tea Party movement grew. I mean, we started seeing, a week and a half after this, Rick Santelli on CNBC does what was called his rant. And he called for a Chicago.
Is that a regular thing? Is it a regular
no.
rant?
It was that. No, he was on the board
of
the
this rant.
This rant,
Okay.
exactly. He was on the board of the Chicago Board of Trade, the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade, and he was talking about, surrounded by traders, he was talking about the Obama administration's plan to bail out people who were underwater in their homes, who paid their mortgages on time but were still underwater in their homes. And he said, this is America. This isn't what this country's about. Do you really want to pay for your neighbor who bought a house he couldn't afford and has an extra bathroom and an extra bedroom, whatever? We're going to have a Tea Party protest in July. Well, that's February, and within hours, young conservatives are on Twitter and they're tweeting about, let's have a Tea Party. And they arrange a conference call for that night, and they have that same conference call for the next week. And they plan Tea Parties across the country. And a week later, there are somewhere between 30 and 50 Tea Parties across the country. And that's sort of when we saw protests like Kelly, the young woman in Seattle. She had the idea for this, and she had the sentiment, but the Santelli rant kind of gave a name to it. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, as what happened with Kelly, people were sort of excited by their first protest. They weren't very big, but it was a way to get your frustration out, and they felt energized by this, and they felt empowered to do more.
So who are they, and what do they want?
Well, I say in the book, it's a little like the blind man and the elephant. It kind of depends on where you're standing. But by and large, I think the Tea Party starts with people who are very concerned about the economy. Now, this could be, again, people with a libertarian bent, like Kelly, or like some of the young conservatives who organized the first Tea Party protests. In the book, I profile a number of young suburban moms who feel like it's a real pocketbook issue, and they look at it and they say, "Hey, we're out of money in this country. Why are we spending more money to get ourselves out of an economic hole?" But as the Tea Party movement grows, I think it attracts a lot more people who are in the book, it's emblemized by a 67-year-old woman named Diana Reimer, and she lives outside of Philadelphia. And she and her husband are like the people Rick Santelli was ranting against, somewhat ironically. They're underwater in their house. And she comes home one day and she turns on Fox News and sees something about the Tea Party and says, like, this is it. This is the way to get out my frustration. And so she becomes the local, the organizer for a local Tea Party. So I think it's this mix of sort of idealistic and ideological young people and sort of people, older people in general, who came to it with more just raw frustration. If you look at polls, it's about 18% of Americans who call themselves Tea Party supporters. Now, this doesn't mean that they've been to a rally or they've given money to a group. It means that they identify with the sentiments of the group, and it's sort of it's largely emotional. It's sort of this anti-establishment sentiment. There's only about 4% of Americans who say they've been to the rallies or have given money. So it's actually not that big a percentage.
Now, the issues seem to be they want less government. They feel the government is intruding into people's lives too much, telling them what to do, spending too much, and want lower taxes. Those seem to be the issues, the main issues, right?
Those are the issues, absolutely, and in particular the first. I mean, if there's a rallying cry for this movement, it's sort of leave me alone, and the sense that the federal government is just doing too many things, and this is why they've embraced the Constitution and sort of the idea, the iconography of the founding fathers in the movement so much. They look at the Constitution and they say, look, here it is in this, Article 2, Section 8. I hope I'm getting that right. Outlines 22 powers for Congress, 22 things that Congress is supposed to be doing. If we look at what the federal government is doing now, and it really has done since the New Deal, it's gone way beyond that. So the true Tea Party view is that programs, departments like the Department of Housing and Urban Development, programs like Social Security, Medicare, that all goes way beyond what the Constitution envisioned the federal government doing.
Now, they're not a real political party in the sense of, that they don't put up candidates themselves. Their real goal is to reform the Republican Party, right?
Right. So yes, absolutely. And a lot of people mistake this for, as you say, a third party. They have learned from the example of Ross Perot and don't believe that the Tea Party should be a third party. They don't think third parties work. So what they want to do is what Dick Armey, who's the former House Majority Leader and now runs a group called Freedom Works, which has helped grow the Tea Party. He calls it a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. By and large, the Tea Party supporters are Republicans, and they identify themselves as very conservative. And their goal is, again, a hostile takeover of the Republican Party to move the Republican Party to the right. So in many ways, the biggest impact of the Tea Party in this election, it'll have an impact in the general election, but it's already had an impact in the primary elections. A lot of these primaries where we've seen Tea Party candidates used to be kind of sleepy affairs. Usually the incumbent didn't get a challenger. There wasn't a primary for the to run as the challenger. So the primaries have seen this huge wave of Tea Party candidates, and the Tea Party has really, in the primaries, tried to move the party to the right.
So they're basically are they Republican candidates? Which Republican candidates the Tea Partiers decide to endorse, or their own candidates?
It's a little of both. So if you look, if you try to identify a Tea Party candidate, I guess there are a number of ways of doing it. I would say Tea Party candidates are people who have come up through the movement. Someone like Ron Johnson, for instance, who's running for Senate in Wisconsin. He's a businessman, wealthy, he runs a plastic manufacturing business, has done very well. But he came to politics, his first political event was a Tea Party rally, or he was invited to speak about the effect of the healthcare legislation on his business. And suddenly he was running for Senate. So that's one model. But the other model is maybe someone who's been a local politician or someone who's run for office before, who's benefited this year from this swell of Tea Party support. So this could be someone like Pat Toomey, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania. And not only have they benefited from this Tea Party sentiment, but they also share the Tea Party ideology, this smaller government ideology, this anti-tax ideology, this sense that we need to get back to a very strict interpretation of the Constitution.
I find some of them contradictory, because when you describe the people that you met, they're not that different from a lot of people that I know, who are middle class, who are college educated, who have also been hit hard by the recession, and who, may need some government help, may actually be getting some government help, whether it's unemployment temporarily or subsidy for COBRA, for health insurance. But my friends are not saying less government and less spending, and so a lot of what they're saying seems to be contradictory, and some of them are actually getting government benefits, right? That
Oh,
you talked
absolutely.
to?
I mean, in our poll, which is included in the back of the book, the poll at the New York Times did, we found that I think it was half of all Tea Party supporters were receiving government benefits, either generally Social Security or Medicare themselves, or lived with someone who did. And most of them didn't want to get rid of those benefits. And again, it's sort of I think it's explained by the dichotomy I talked about earlier. The movement was started by sort of young ideologues who do believe in getting rid of these programs, who aren't benefiting from these programs. What happened was a lot of these older people came to the movement later, and they sort of signed on for an ideology but not really realizing it. So their statements are contradictory. We all remember the poster, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." So I absolutely think there are many contradictions in this. I think there was a moment when left and right might have agreed on things like, for instance, the bailouts. But while the left was saying the answer is more government regulation of the banks, what the Tea Party is saying is we need less regulation. We need the market. We need the free market to be allowed to flourish more. So again, there's some agreement, but their solutions are very, very different.
Yeah. Are they anti-government or just anti-this government?
Well, first of all, I should say they're anti-federal government, and they are so they believe the state should be allowed to do a lot more. But the Tea Party, there's no question, the Tea Party would not have come about if there were a Republican in the White House. I think, one question that people always have is this a reflection of the first African-American president? I don't think that's it so much as it is a Democratic president who was proposing a really ambitious social agenda, particularly on health care. We saw the same opposition to Bill Clinton when he tried to propose a health care reform. And I think had Fox News been around when Bill Clinton was in office, it might have been more heated. It was plenty heated at the time, but I think we might have seen it become much more of a movement because Fox News and the conservative media establishment has really helped grow this.
So why didn't they come into being when you had Bush in the White House, who has this hugely expensive war that created a huge deficit, and he also had the Medicare reform, which is costing us, I think you say in the book, more than than the bailouts and all of the Obama's program altogether. Why didn't they rise up under Bush?
Well, first I should say that some of the groups that have helped the Tea Party, groups like Freedom Works, Dick Armey's group, did actually protest the expansion of Medicare under Bush. So there is some consistency there. But for the most part, the rank and file of the Tea Party did not. And I think it's explained by the fact that they describe themselves as very conservative, and they are Republicans. They're not inclined to go against the grain of a Republican president who's claiming to be a conservative. Some of the conservatives, Kelly Carrinder, for instance, the first Tea Party I talked about in Seattle, she did object to Bush. She did object to the spending with Bush. I think you didn't get the groundswell because, frankly, the economy cratered right before, at the end of Bush's term. And I think without that, we wouldn't have seen this. But with regard to the war, again, remember these are very conservative Republicans. They define themselves that way. They're not people who are going to be inclined to go against a commander-in-chief in wartime. So it's interesting, again, some of the contradictions. Ron Paul is a huge favorite among a lot of people in the movement because they like his libertarian ideology. They like what he says about going back to the constitutional limits on spending. But when Ron Paul shows up at a rally and begins talking about how we need to pull our troops out of Korea and Japan, I witnessed this moment, it's in the book. He shows up and first he's talking about we need to audit the Fed, and the crowd's going, yeah, audit the Fed. And then he says, cut our spending, go back to constitutional limits, yes. And then he says we need to get our troops out of Korea and Japan. And the crowd completely turns on him and begins, chanting, support our troops, USA. So again, it's a real contradiction.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more with Kate Zernike, author of Boiling Mad, Inside Tea Party America.
CUNY votes?
CUNY votes!
That's what CUNY Senior Vice Chancellor Jay Hershenson hopes for come November 2nd, but he knows getting students to vote on Election Day isn't easy.
27% of the registered voters in New York City during the municipal election last year voted. That's abysmal.
And stats show younger people like college students are even less likely to pull a lever at a poll.
People have been drifting apart from politics because they're so hesitant to get involved.
To get students to the polls, promote school spirit and civic responsibility, campus bookstores are doing what everyone loves. They're offering a sale. For now until Election Day, you can get 25% off school apparel. The whole goal is that you will wear your school colors when you go out to vote.
I'm wearing this, and I'll probably get a hat too. So I have to thank Barnes & Noble again for the 25% discount.
Students are excited about the promotion, as is Chancellor Matthew Goldstein.
Well, I think it's a good thing to say CUNY is involved in the city. And by showing their colors and the institution from which they come, I think it sends a very powerful message that a great university is taking this very seriously.
When school officials pitched their plan to help students pinch pennies and show their school pride, Barnes & Nobles and Follett's bookstores happily obliged.
Hopefully it creates some enthusiasm with the students to get out and to vote and to show their school colors.
I think we have to get rid of the apathy and get engaged and involved. The issues before voters are about you.
Students are buying into the plan.
It represents our right to change this country for the better.
I think it's great. It represents our college and represents CUNY as a whole to let us know that as college students represents.
It's almost the same as sportsmanship. You want people to know, like, hey, you know, I'm a John Jay student and I'm out here and I'm voting. So it really is a fundamental right, and we take it for granted.
To make sure you don't take it for granted and to learn more about voting and this promotion, you can log on to cuny.edu/vote or visit the CUNY Votes Facebook page.
Show your school spirit, be part of the community, and be sure to vote on Tuesday, November 2nd.
For CUNY TV, I'm Grant Greenberg.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with New York Times national correspondent Kate Zernike, the author of Boiling Mad: Inside Tea Party America. Have you ever run into any blacks or Latinos at any of the Tea Party events?
Absolutely, definitely. But we don't see them represented in the same proportion that they are in the population at large. And I will say, you know, the organizations that have helped grow the Tea Party movement will offer training to these local groups, and they'll say, you know, it's really important for you to put a black person on stage, put a Hispanic person on stage at your rallies to show that we're not a racist movement. And you do tend to see the same people speaking at these events over and over because there just isn't a large pool to choose from. But I think it's absolutely, you know, I think people who say, well, there are no blacks there are wrong. I mean, we see them on stage and we also see them in the crowd.
Is it strictly a grassroots kind of organization in terms of financing, or are there any big money donors?
Oh no, they're definitely big money donors. I think the mistake people make is in believing that because they're big money donors now, that this movement was created by those big money donors. And frankly, a lot of these groups that, you know, we hear about, for instance, the Koch brothers who run a group called Americans for Prosperity. They're wealthy businessmen, Kansas-based, and Freedom Works, which is another one, again, the one I mentioned, run by Dick Armey. These groups have been trying to create a grassroots movement behind their causes, behind this free market libertarian ideology for years, and they hadn't been able to do it because you can't just snap your fingers and create a grassroots movement. So they needed the groundswell of emotion that came with the economic collapse. But that said, once they saw that, they absolutely rushed in to cultivate this, to fertilize it, and to grow it. So they've done things like offer training for Tea Party groups. They've, you know, in the instant right after Rick Santelli did his rant on CNBC, groups like Freedom Works were up, you know, had a website telling people what to write on their signs and telling people how to create a Tea Party and how to, you know, take it to the next town over and do the same thing there. So I absolutely think there has been cooperation, and especially as we move toward the general election, there has been a lot of big money coming in to help these candidates, help the Tea Party candidates, and to finance get out the vote operations.
Now you have Carl Palladino, who's running for governor in New York, and you have Christine O'Donnell, who's running for senator in Delaware.
Yeah.
Did they come from the Tea Party, or are they just sort of people who the Tea Party supports?
Well, I think Carl Palladino is sort of the classic someone who came up, maybe not through the movement, but came up in a year where this movement was prominent. I think we wouldn't have seen a Carl Palladino 2006, for instance. We wouldn't have seen him go as far as he has. Christine O'Donnell actually ran against Joe Biden the last time he ran and went nowhere, but she was the Republican Party candidate. She's not someone who comes out of the Tea Party movement. She's more a vehicle for the Tea Party frustration. The Tea Party people in Delaware were not so much supporting Christine O'Donnell as they were opposing her moderate Republican opponent in the primary, a guy named Mike Castle, who's sort of the emblem of the Northeastern moderate Republican. So Christine O'Donnell, I mean, again, Christine O'Donnell's a good example of how this is actually a grassroots movement, not an astroturf movement. A lot of these big Republican groups in Washington did not want her to win because they don't think she can win the general election.
Both of them, both Palladino and O'Donnell, I mean, they seem so over the top and out there and a little crazy. Is this a little off the wall. Is this typical of Tea Party candidates?
Well,
or
it's funny. I did a show with James Carville a couple weeks ago, and he was saying that he thinks in some cases the candidates are crazier than the Tea Partiers themselves. So I would say that these are the outliers. These are the true exceptions. Not that we haven't seen. There's the guy in Ohio who dresses up as a Nazi on weekends. So there are certainly other examples of out there Tea Party candidates. On the other hand, someone like Ron Johnson running for Senate in Wisconsin doesn't seem that crazy. I mean, he comes across as a fairly reasonable guy. Even Rand Paul, who in Kentucky, who's made some outrageous statements, has campaigned much more as the reasonable Republican candidate. So I think it's a mix. I think not all of these candidates are Christine O'Donnell. That said, they do have some ideas, particularly on things like Social Security and Medicare, that run against what most Americans support.
I know that some Tea Partiers take the position that they want to avoid the social issues. They want to focus on the size of government, on government spending and taxing. But are there social issues that a lot of them agree on?
Yeah, I mean, again, and polls tell us this. A lot of these people are social conservatives, even if they don't want to talk. They're social conservatives by definition, by self-definition, and by nature. They don't want to talk about these issues, but it's very hard to keep them out because there are people who want to talk about things like immigration. I would say that abortion and gay marriage really have not been part of the campaign discussion this year, largely because of the Tea Party has steered the conversation away from that. But again, at the National Tea Party Convention in February in Nashville, you heard speakers, not just people in the audience, speakers actually talking about, is the president legitimately an American citizen? What about the birth certificate? You heard them talking about the need for a culture war. So it's been very hard for the Tea Party to completely keep these issues out. And
there again, it seems somewhat contradictory because, I happen to personally think that the best thing the Bush administration did was to propose real immigration reform. And you would think that that would be something that would really get the Tea Party types up in arms.
That they would oppose it.
Well,
and they do, and that's why a lot of them were not enthusiastic about John McCain. I think they identified that much more with McCain than they did with Bush. But it's interesting. There are groups. There's a big group called Tea Party Patriots, a nationwide group that does not want to talk about immigration because they think it's too divisive. But many of these local groups, particularly in the border states, are all about immigration, and they feel like this is one social issue that they have completely embraced.
How do you feel about them personally when you meet them on the road?
In some cases you do meet people who say these things that are completely off the wall, but I have to say that, a lot of the people, I came to this movement, I'd been on leave and I came back in November of 2009 and began covering it. And what struck me, I'd only seen the rallies like most of us on television, and what struck me when I talked to a lot of people was how average they sounded and how normal they sounded. And then I started looking around my own neighborhood and seeing people who were expressing some of the same sentiments. So I think, we need to recognize, even if we don't agree with this movement, we need to recognize that it's out there and that it's not, they're not all nut jobs.
What's the obsession with this? I mean, this whole thing, that Obama's taking us to a socialist type government. That seems to be a real obsession.
Well, I think this is something that's been promoted in particular by Glenn Beck on Fox. He talks about socialism and Marxism, but this is also part sort of the libertarian ideology, which is that that you start with any kind of social program like healthcare or like Medicare, Social Security, and suddenly you can't go part way. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You're going to go all the way on the road to socialism, and it's going to be a completely socialistic system very soon. Now, obviously the hyperbole here is enormous.
Now you wrote about some people who've actually given up their jobs to devote their time to the Tea Party. I mean, is it sort of like for some people, is it sort of like a religion?
Oh, absolutely. And I hesitate to say quasi-religious because that makes people think that these are just the old Christian conservatives, and they are different in many respects. But people in my book say things like, this is the most important thing I've ever done with my life. I mean, they really believe, to them, it's provided a community and it's provided a cause. And that sort of explains to me the staying power of the Tea Party and why they have been so insistent and so determined in things like backing Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. They really believed against hope that they could win, and lo and behold, they did win.
Who does the who does the Tea Party movement benefit most, Republicans or Democrats?
Oh, it's hard to say because there are many cases, certainly the energy of the Tea Party has helped the Republican Party in this midterm election. But that said, they've also, in the primaries, they've nominated some candidates who are pretty far to the right and who the Democrats have been able to portray as extremist candidates. So there are some districts where we see they should be leaning Republican by demographics, by voter registration, but in fact the Democrat is doing well because they're running against a Tea Party candidate who the Democrat has been able to say is too extreme for a moderate district.
Now, if they actually achieved their stated goals, if we got rid of Social Security, if we had no government guaranteed medical health insurance, if we had let the big banks and the car companies collapse or whatever they want to do on their own, if we let charity take care of the poor, wouldn't there be chaos? I mean,
one might argue that. I mean, again, I think a lot of these things that they talk about are things we've heard about before. I mean, right down to getting rid of the Department of Education, which is something that Ronald Reagan talked about, right? But I think, what they would say is, well, we should replace Medicare and Social Security with private savings account, with medical savings accounts. Now, you could make a really good argument that that's sort of like what we did with the housing market, that we let people decide for themselves how much of a mortgage they could take on, what kind of a house they could afford, and that led to this enormous collapse. So again, it's this huge contradiction here.
Mm-hmm. So we've got about a minute left. So in that minute, in your view, what do they really want? What would they be happy with?
Well, look, I think a lot of this is purely emotional, and so a lot of it is very reactive and is a bit of a throw the bums out movement. I think that at heart they do want to have less government spending. The problem is they also want lower taxes, and I think pretty much every economist agrees that that's a hard combination. So I think what they're really saying is it's a protest against the establishment. They want things to change in Washington. Now again, part of changing in Washington means getting things done, and I think what the Tea Party unfortunately is promoting is a gridlock government, because they're saying we're going to fight the president on spending, we're going to fight the president on taxes, and that's not a recipe for getting things done.
Well, they're very interesting, and we're going to see what impact they have on this coming election.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank Kate Zernike for joining us today. Boiling Mad: Inside Tea Party America has just been published by the Times Books imprint of Henry Holt and Company. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.